Two teenage girls were murdered on the same California beach 6 years apart. The details of the attacks that shocked the community were strikingly similar. But it wasn't until decades later that DNA evidence pointed to two suspects. One of them worked at the very police department that was investigating the case. 48 Hours correspondent Richard Schlesinger has a preview of the re-airing of Blood in the Sand.
Torrey Pines is a beautiful piece of nature in Southern California. What's beautiful about a beach is also what's dangerous about it. There's a very different vibe of what it feels like to be there in the middle of the day versus 10 at night. There is a little feeling of you don't know exactly what's out there. In 1978, Barbara Nante and Jim Alt decided to go on a camping trip to the beach at Torrey Pines.
Stole my heart the minute I saw her. You know, it's that feeling everyone gets, you know, when you find that person that fits.
They were really good together. They loved each other. They had so much fun together, and you could see it. Barbara, she was outspoken, very popular, funny. Jim, great personality. He was the life of the party. And my sister was like that, too.
Barbara and Jim set up their sleeping bags on the beach itself, and it was sometime in the night after they had fallen asleep that they were attacked. Jim Alt had been beaten and was very severely injured.
I was knocked unconscious. I couldn't protect her. I couldn't defend myself.
My dad looked at me and said, "Your sister's been murdered." I didn't find out till years later how bad it really was.
I'm going to say the body was around this position here somewhere. They found her lying here nude, and she also had some cut marks on one of her breasts.
Who would want to kill her, and why?
6 years later, in 1984, another young woman, Claire Huff, who was 14, was found murdered on Torrey Pines at nearly the identical location.
I just said, don't go down there alone. I think about her just about every day. She was my best friend.
You get to this crime scene, look at the body, and see what?
Again, there was a mutilation of the breast. My first thought was, hey, this is very similar to the one that happened 6 years ago.
How much evidence was there? How many leads?
Not any at all, really.
I just remember going crazy in my mind. Is there something I'm not remembering? Is there something I saw?
I want to put a face to this crime because it's been faceless for almost 37 years.
There really was no big break until 2012 when police finally got hits on the DNA evidence that they had from the crime scene.
San Diego police have identified a former San Diego police criminalist as one of two suspects in the 1984 murder of 14-year-old Claire Huff.
It was a big surprise that of all people in the world you could find as a suspect, that it would be somebody who had actually worked for the police department.
He had a nickname in the crime lab, right? You know what that was?
His nickname was Kinky. He liked strip clubs, he liked taking pictures of women.
My husband didn't do it. He didn't go after teenagers. I knew they were wrong.
This has multiple suspects. There are a variety of motives. As a murder mystery, this has everything you would want.
Senior executive producer of 48 Hours, Susan Zirinsky, is here with me on set to talk a little bit more about this report. Z, so was there a DNA link to the multiple suspects?
Here's the thing. These cases were old. These two young women killed. Only one of them had DNA on it, but she had two parts of DNA on it from two different people. But the cases were so closely linked by MO, both found at the beach. The whole method of murder was similar, but there was no DNA on Barbara Nantes or her boyfriend who was attacked at the same time. But what happens is that the two DNA, one is from a guy with a long rap sheet. He had been a rapist. But the other one is from somebody in the police lab. And it ends up that the police lab, that the technician, the scientist from the police lab, ends up killing himself. He was under suspicion. So the focus of the investigation goes on the man who committed suicide. It is a very complex case.
Right.
what's really fascinating is that in a DNA crime lab, in a police lab, very often the scientists, the experts, they harvest themselves for DNA to do a kind of test sample. I'm not going to tell you where they get that DNA from, but in this case, it's a most extreme circumstance, and that is where this story is. It is an update, but the DNA is fascinating.
Because people, when we think of DNA, we think of that as solid evidence. Once they say, you know, we got DNA, you think, well, there's very little opportunity to argue that that's not who the DNA points to.
Absolutely, but we have had cases of contamination. In this case, you have DNA from a scientist in a police lab, a forensic guy, and you have the DNA from a rapist, a guy with a rap sheet as long as I'm tall. Although that may not be that long, but in truth, the DNA is an excruciatingly positive development, and now with the familial DNA, it's yet another level. But when it happens and there's mixed DNA, you can really confuse a case. And in this case, you have a dead forensics scientist and a wife who feels like her husband was blamed for this one murder, and he did kill himself. So is that guilt, or couldn't live with the shame? Yeah, well, there are questions of the guilt of other suspects in this case, too. Correct. Yeah. Correct. I mean, you know, the other suspect who really was a career criminal, the police had a theory at one point that the police forensic lab and the criminal were in cahoots. So that also was very confusing. People still believe, though, that the one young woman, Barbara Nantes, who had died earlier, that the cases are linked and that there just wasn't DNA available at that point. So when Huff died, the DNA was indicative, but you got this 2 DNA, and I'm hoping that somehow this case can be really just finally solved. The wife of the forensic scientist, the lab technician, is suing the police for wrongful death of her husband. So it's a complex case. Very complex. Can't wait to watch it. Susan Zirinsky, thank you very much for stopping by. Appreciate it. Thank you. And of course, you can watch the re-airing of the full 48 Hours report, Blood in the Sand, tomorrow night at 10, 9 Central on CBS.